أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الصلاة والسلام على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ربي زدني علما. So assalamu alaikum everyone. Today's reflection is called Acknowledge Your Vulnerability to Nafs al-Ammārah. So we have been discussing over the last couple of days how the human being is an honored creature of God. And the human being is innately programmed towards seeking truth, beauty, and goodness. And he's pre-programmed from knowing right from wrong. The natural question that arises, of course, is if this is the innate nature of human beings, why do we so often act against it? Now, here's the thing. The Qur'an does not present the human beings as flat or a one-dimensional creature. The angels, for example, are created simply to obey. They do not have any other options. Animals, on the other hand, live by instinct. The human being is a multi-dimensional creature. We have layers within us, states of the self. Like we said, we're made from earth and we have the breath of God. So we have the ability to rise or to fall. We move along a spectrum. We are capable of good and evil, and we have the free will to choose. So our inner life is dynamic, not static. So let us begin by exploring the states of the self or nafs as described in the Quran. The Quranic term nafs is generally translated in English as psyche or self or ego. It represents a person's inner being, encompassing consciousness, desires, and inclinations, and it is often associated with the lower impulsive self that requires spiritual purification. So we've all heard the term taskiyatun nafs, right? And this is what we mean, that the lower self requires some sort of discipline, some sort of restraint in order to achieve tranquility. So the nafs is fluid and it constantly struggles between base desires, which are our earthly side, and submitting to divine guidance. When we control the baser desires of the nafs in line with divine guidance, we can set to be closer to the higher states of the self. So now, while Islamic spiritual traditions talk of several states of the nafs, by some literature will talk about the 7 stages of the self, the Quran mentions at least 3 states, right? And so the first one, which we will be discussing today, is called Nafs al-Ammārah, or the commanding self. And this comes in Surah Yusuf, verse 53, which we shall discuss today. The second or another stage of the nafs is Nafs al-Lawwāmah, which is the self-reproaching soul. And when we come to that, we'll explain more about what that is. And then we have Nafs al-Mutma'innah, which is the tranquil self. So our reflection is from verse 53 from Surah Yusuf, which speaks about the Nafs al-Ammārah. Now, to give a little bit of background on the story, many of us are very familiar with Nabi Yusuf's story. You know, Surah Yusuf is just, it reads like a novel, right? It has such, and the Quran calls it the best of stories as well. So one part of the story is about how Yusuf, who was known to be extremely handsome, extremely good looking, was pursued by the wife of the Aziz, by the wife of the ruler of the time, or the king. Her name was Zulaykha. And, they were in a secluded place. She actually locked the doors and she tried to seduce him, right? And, he leaves the situation, and to the extent that she pursues him and she, tears his shirt tears from the back. So we're kind of all familiar with the story, right? Now, when the king kind of confronts them, and Zulaykha admits that it was she who had approached Yusuf and tried to seduce him, Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam says with beautiful humility, he says, "Wama ubirriyu nafsi inna nafsat al-ammārah bisu," means, and I do not declare myself free. Most surely man's self, yani nafsatul ammara, is wont to command him to do evil. except such as my Lord has mercy on. Illa ma rahima rabbi. Inna rabbi ghafurur rahim. And surely my Lord is forgiving, merciful. So, what Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam is doing, he's admitting that man with a human nature is just replete with frailties, and he cannot excuse himself of the baser tendencies that are present in his soul. And he says that it was only God's grace and mercy that prevented him from falling prey to the inclinations of his Nafs al-Ammārah, right? From his soul that commands towards evil. So we said that Nafs al-Ammārah in Quranic psychology is kind of the lowest level of the nafs, right? Ammara is actually an intensive form, meaning constantly commanding or strongly urging. In other words, it's not a one-time thing. It will continue to nag you. When you read this, and many Muslim psychologists will compare this to the addicted brain, right? That there are very strong drives within the nafs to go down a certain path. And, when the kind of this Nafs al-Ammārah, or what we would call the addicted brain, for example, in modern psychology, when that takes it over, it is very strong. That's why we say, I have no control over my urges, right? That's what addiction is, when you lose control over that which calls you, okay? So this, verse is spoken in the context of extreme self-awareness and humility. I do not absolve myself. In other words, I do not consider myself too high to be subject to this nafs. Okay, and then the verse ends with hope. Except whom my Lord has mercy upon. So Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam is acknowledging that the Nafs al-Ammārah is constantly commanding or strongly urging towards those thoughts and actions that lead to forgetfulness, of God, and to go against his command. And so again, the language he uses is it's full of humility and self-awareness, right? Admitting that he's human and that he's also vulnerable to these commands. Very importantly, however, Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam is also giving us one of the keys to overcome the strong urgings of the Nafs al-Ammārah. Firstly, you must acknowledge your vulnerability and appeal to Allah's mercy, grace, and forgiveness. When these urges are so strong, if you are disconnected from God, it becomes very, very challenging. So from the Quranic story, we also learn that Yusuf's situation was full of temptations, right? He was pursued by a woman. There were locked doors, there was nobody else. They were isolated. And so it was very easy to fall into this temptation. But when Zulaikha approached him, he exited immediately. He did not, go into a long dialogue. And this is a very key thing to note, that we need to change environments. When the situation is full of temptation, our nafs is, willpower can only last so long. And that's why in Islam, we have so many clear boundaries. We have so many protections, scaffolding for our nafs, right? So, on a practical level, what can we learn from this verse, right? Because his response is a powerful model of how to handle Nafs al-Ammārah. And then we can reflect on how to recognize our own Nafs al-Ammārah, right? Because we said that, his first step was to be self-aware. So we need to practice that as well. And as we should see, it is quite an uncomfortable thing to do. So we need to be in touch with and acknowledge our vulnerabilities. This is so much easier said than done. When we see others making poor choices or falling into disobedience, it is tempting to become judgy and look down upon the other, feeling superior. It is much more helpful for ourselves, perhaps at that moment, to remind ourselves that we too are vulnerable to the Nafs al-Ammārah, that people struggle in different ways. We have different things that tempt us. We have different vulnerabilities, different weaknesses. And so to be constantly calling upon divine guidance, mercy, and grace, we can actively pray for guidance and pray for the courage to obey that guidance, because guidance comes. Our conscience will whisper to us, our mind will tell us this is not a good idea, but we somehow are not able to stop ourselves in that moment. And then when being in an environment with triggers and temptations, do what Yusuf did and leave as soon as you can, right? It is, the momentary pleasure, what scripture reminds us is not worth it. It is not worth the damage that we do to our souls. And then firmly resolve not to return even at a personal cost. So that's kind of the model. But the first step is to be, to accept our own vulnerabilities and to kind of become experts on, what our own temptations are, right? So, that's the first thing that we learn from him. We cannot manage what we're not aware of. So how do we begin? And I will say this again, we always talk about self-awareness. We hear about self-awareness, how it is so important on the path of spiritual growth, how it is the first step, because again, we cannot change what we're not aware of. And what is less talked about is how challenging and uncomfortable this process is, right? Self-knowledge, I always like to say, is not a pretty thing. When we figure out what trips us, what tempts us, what leads us astray, it is very challenging to acknowledge that within ourselves and then to make a plan to do something different, right? So what do we begin by noticing? When we are driven towards immediate gratifications, right? We give into cravings, we give into addictions, we give into temptations. And by noticing when we discount long-term consequences of our actions, right? I mean, I always give this example of, why do I eat chocolate, right? When I know it's bad for my health, because I don't, at some stage, I think it's not going to apply to me. It's not going to be that bad, right? Sometimes we rationalize harmful behavior towards ourselves or others, right? For example, as a parent, I may tell myself, if I'm feeling guilty, to silence my guilt, I may say something, my kid deserved the yelling I gave them, right? And so when we are driven by appetite, comfort, and avoidance of discomfort, and we seek, for example, more food than is needed, something many of us struggle with, right? We even call it comfort eating. More pleasure than it is healthy, more sleep than beneficial, right? So our mind is telling us, our intellect, our rationale is telling us that, it knows what we need to do, and yet our nafs is taking us a completely different direction, right? When we tell ourselves just one more time, just one more piece of chocolate, I deserve this, right? I deserve this. It doesn't matter. I'll deal with the consequences later, because in the moment, the temptation gets the better of us, right? No one needs to know, or at least, this is one of my favorites in the sense we hear this so often, right? At least I don't do X, so I'm not as bad as them, right? So we can tell, if any of these conversations are going on in our heads, even very subtly, we may not even be aware of. But when we begin to listen, when we begin to notice, we can say that our Nafs al-Ammārah is very active at that time, right? So from a psychological perspective, we can say that the Nafs al-Ammārah is anything, it commands us against our own long-term flourishing, right? For example, it prefers dopamine over discipline. Like we know spending hours on Instagram is literally going to bring us no good. We will, when we finish that session of doom scrolling, we will be depressed, right? Sitting on the couch and not moving, our backs will hurt, right? We know this, but the discipline wins over. The dopamine wins over the discipline, right? We prioritize comfort over growth. We escape, we do numbing over healing or transformation. So all of these are signs that our brain is kind of the addicted brain. It's been hijacked by temptation. Modern psychology calls it all sorts of things, right? The addicted brain is actually a very good understanding of what Nafs al-Ammārah is, right? Because it's again those strong urges that command you towards that which is not good for you. That's basically it. Whenever we are going against our best judgment and doing things which we, remember that it's been hardwired, right? We know things that are good for us or not, and yet we continue to do them. So before we get too discouraged, okay, remember I did say that it is an uncomfortable process, but here's the thing, that without this kind of awareness, we cannot begin the journey, right? So before we get too discouraged, it's very important to note that the verse ends on a critical qualifier: except those upon whom my Lord has mercy. In other words, we're all subject to this temptation. We may have cultivated a dopamine driven, distracted brain by indulging in so much technology, speaking only about myself. And we also have the means and the knowledge to walk ourselves back to a place of well being. And this can only happen when we call upon God and ask Him to help us. And the Lord has shown us so much grace and mercy by gifting us this month of blessings, when self-restraint becomes so much easier, and we begin to notice how, as the spiritual atmosphere around us increases, the grip of the Nafs al-Ammārah weakens. So, let's use this month. Let's get rid of some bad habit. Inshallah, whatever we are struggling with, we have the self-control and the discipline at least to do it for 30 days, right? And when those 30 days are over, inshallah, it will not come back on Eid, right? We will have developed the muscle, the training in our nafs to be able to overcome whatever bad habit we may be struggling with. So inshallah, may God guide us, and may Allah have mercy upon all of us. Ameen. Inshallah, see you tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.